Look at the paper sitting on your desk. It is so thin, it barely registers as a physical object. But before we engineered paper, recording a sentence required physical effort. Writers had to carve characters into heavy materials like wood and bamboo. You can see this physical limitation in early alternatives, like this Egyptian papyrus fragment. Made by pressing plant stalks into a grid, it was lighter than wood, but it grew exclusively in Egypt and became brittle over time. Here we have an early bound manuscript written on parchment. Parchment is created by stretching, scraping, and drying the untanned skins of animals, like sheep or calves. Creating a single book this way required processing an entire herd. For thousands of years, writing was bound by these constraints. To preserve memory, you needed access to specific regional plants or large, expensive herds of animals. Storing significant amounts of information took up massive amounts of physical space and required immense wealth. This image shows stacks of traditional bamboo text rolls. 2,000 years ago in the Han Dynasty, imperial libraries overflowed with cumbersome piles exactly like this. Moving a single document could require a cart. A court official named Sai Lun observed this growing logistical nightmare. He realized to make writing truly portable, society had to stop writing on solid, rigid objects. His solution was to destroy the raw materials entirely. By taking old fish nets, rags, and tree bark, and physically beating them into a wet pulp, he could break these solid items down and reconstruct them into a completely flat, uniform plane. This traditional illustration shows laborers gathering the raw materials for early papermaking. They are harvesting bast fibers from mulberry shoots. Bast fibers are the strong, woody materials found in the inner bark or phloem of certain plants. As shown in this historical diagram, the harvested bark was boiled in a vat over a furnace with wood ash. The alkaline ash caused a chemical reaction, dissolving lignins inside the plant. Lignins are complex organic polymers that make plant cell walls rigid and woody. With the rigid structure of the plant dissolved, the remaining material was washed and beaten for hours with heavy wooden mallets. This mechanical pounding separated the material into millions of individual thread-like cellulose strands. What was once a living, structured tree was reduced to a microscopic soup. The papermaker had successfully dismantled nature down to its cellular building blocks, ready to be engineered. The next step is a process called hogging. Hogging is the act of vigorously mixing the beaten cellulose pulp into a large vat of water until the fibers are completely and evenly dispersed, creating a highly dilute suspension. Look at the papermaker in this photo. She is holding a mold, a wooden frame with a woven screen, surrounded by a decal. A decal is a removable outer rim that determines the size and shape of the paper. As she lifts the mold from the vat, the water drains through the screen, leaving a wet mat of intertwined fibers trapped on the surface. As this wet mat dries, an invisible reaction takes place: hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding is an electrostatic attraction where oxygen and hydrogen atoms on the surface of the cellulose fibers chemically link to one another as the water evaporates. The sheet literally glues itself together. This liquid process slowly traveled westward along the Silk Road. By the 8th century, it reached the city of Samarkand. There, artisans realized they didn't need mulberry bark. They adapted the process to use local resources, turning discarded linen and cotton rags into high-quality pulp. This adaptability was the true power of the vat. Papermaking wasn't tied to a specific climate like Egyptian papyrus or massive wealth like animal parchment. It was an industrial recipe consuming agricultural waste and discarded textiles of any society on Earth. When the craft eventually reached Europe, the physical labor of beating the pulp was mechanized. In this model of an early European paper mill, you can see how flowing water from the stream was used to power large wooden trip hammers, automating the destruction of old rags. Italian paper makers in Fabriano introduced a security feature seen in this artifact, the watermark. A raised wire design was sewn onto the screen. When wet pulp settled over the wire, the fiber layer became thinner, allowing more light to pass through the finished page. By manipulating the thickness of the pulp itself, manufacturers guaranteed their quality. The physical object became a record of its origin, securing trust in an expanding commercial market. To finalize the sheet, the wet mat of fibers must be removed from the screen through a delicate action called couching. This technique presses the newly formed paper off the mold and onto a piece of absorbent wool felt. The papermaker builds a tall stack of alternating wet paper and felt, then places the stack under a heavy screw press. Immense pressure squeezes out the remaining liquid, compressing the loose fibers into a tight, dense layer. Finally, the damp sheets are brought to a drying loft, like the one in this photograph. Here, the paper is hung in the open air, where natural light and ventilation draw out the last traces of moisture. As that water evaporates, those chemical hydrogen bonds lock into place. The cellular architecture of the sheet is fixed permanently. A quick polish with a smooth stone burnishes the surface, flattening any stray fibers and preparing the sheet to hold sharp lines of wet ink. Looking closely at this finished surface, you can see exactly what paper actually is. It is a resilient matrix of the natural world, a web built from the shredded, boiled, and beaten remnants of plants and discarded clothes. By figuring out how to deconstruct the heavy, rigid materials around them, early artisans created a lightweight, infinitely reproducible surface. Before we had hard drives or silicon chips, this simple mesh of dried cellulose carried the weight of human history across the globe.